is where you'd start the discussion process. It's a working process, but under week 1, you'll find the PowerPoints for the material coming. So, if we want to talk about world religions, then obviously, one place that is useful to start is by talking about what religion is. Interestingly, this is actually very difficult to do. There's no definition of religion that everybody agrees on across the board. What people often end up doing, rather than having a definition, is they have kind of what in psychology we call a family resemblance model. In other words, religions look at things like worldview and human nature and the afterlife and blah, blah, rituals, ethics. So they describe all these elements of religion, and the more of those you have, the more likely we are to call it a religion. And then you get into debates about, well, is this a religion or not? Is atheism a religion if they don't believe in God? So I wanted to look at religion in terms of the root, and I'll have my Latin scholar correct me here. But the word religion comes, as I understand it, from the root re ligare, and ligare is the root of words like ligament, that holds your muscles to your bones. So it means to connect, to attach, to unite. So religion, religare, is to reunite. Now what's interesting is in the East, they often talk about religious approaches as yoga, which comes from the Sanskrit root yuj. And I don't really speak Sanskrit, but I know a few words. Anyway, yuj, which means yoke, like literally the yoke of a plow that you attach to the cattle to pull the plow, right? So interestingly, both of these words have to do with yoking or union or bringing things together. What is being brought together? Well, a religious viewpoint seems to be one that says in some sense or another we live in two worlds, not one. There is an ordinary world of utilitarian values, shopping, making your bed, getting your car fixed, all that kind of stuff, right? But what religion often seems to say across the board is there is a larger world of meaning and purpose that sometimes we lose track of in the day-to-day performance of our duties. Mircea Eliade.
It's a great name.
Mircea is my understanding of how you pronounce it. I was waiting to see.
Yeah, no, that's what I would do.
Mircea Eliade was a Hungarian scholar of religion, and he talks about this as the difference between the sacred and the profane. Now, one of the things we'll see as we get into religion or different religions, is not all religious viewpoints see those as extremely separate. When we get into primal religions, this is the sacred world, and yet, still, in a certain sense, you can do things in a sacred way, as opposed to an ordinary way of doing things. And so, anyway, we'll talk about that a little bit. So, religion, the way that I'm going to kind of loosely define it, is really a set of beliefs about ultimate values in life, about meaning and purpose in life. One of my psychology heroes, Eric Fromm, says that one of the things and I'll say more about this later, next time, one of the things we need as human beings is some type of framework of meaning and purpose, right? We don't live just based on instincts. We need guidance in life, how to live. And so religion kind of provides that. And again, lifts us out of just the ordinary day-to-day approach of sort of living our lives.
Can I ask the word profane? How are you using the word profane? Because today, we typically, when we hear the word profane, we take it to an extreme.
Yeah, so in this sense, it doesn't mean profane, like you've profaned the idols by defecating on them or chopping off their noses or whatever. It just means the world that has lost a sense of the sacred.
I like that. That sounds nice, yeah.
Which is the world that many of us live in.
True.
So towards the end of the course, when we talk about the role of religion in the modern world, that's going to be a very important question for us. Is do these religious takes on meaning and purpose have anything valuable to say to us? So we want to ask about these ultimate values, the meaning, the purpose. Religions are going to say, well, this life has meaning, life has purpose. We want to know if that's true, and how do we decide what's true? Well, in this approach, in the way that I'm kind of easing into talking about religion here, I'm using a distinction that's made by Karen Armstrong, who has written many books in the field of religion. The History of God was her first one, kind of famous about that, in the 90s. And she talks about two ways of understanding, two ways of approaching truth, which she calls mythos and logos. And if you're in psychology, you can think about that a little bit as mythos is kind of a little more right-brained, logos is a little more left-brained. That's an oversimplification. But anyway, logos is the world of reason. The logos is the world where you can precisely define things and measure things. So it's the world of science, you know, where you can have measurable quantities, precise definitions, you can be accurate, you can be objective, and other people can verify. Yeah. So science is concerned with observable reality. And one of the interesting tensions we'll see when we get to religion in the modern world is the tension between a religious viewpoint and a scientific materialist viewpoint. Not all scientists are materialists, but one that basically says there is only the material world, and meaning and purpose are just kind of arbitrary human constructions.
Who'd you say you took this?
Karen Armstrong. So myth, on the other hand, is just a different way of talking about reality. In our modern world, we tend to use the word myth as a synonym for false, right? Oh, that's mythical. Unicorns, they're mythical. In other words, they don't exist. You know, dragons, mythical. No historical evidence for those, whatever, right? And one of the ways we talk about myths is as other people's religions. So this is a little provocative here, right? Because if I'm Christian and I have a dying and resurrected God, then I might say, well, that's a literal truth. But if somebody else, like Mithra, was a dying and resurrected God, well, that's just a myth, all right? So the myth, that's not true. That's the way we tend to look at myth. Now, Karen Armstrong and many other scholars, that some of whom we'll talk about in this class, say, no, myth doesn't mean false. It doesn't mean that it's not true. It's another way of talking about truth. It's a way of talking about truth as a symbol, in a symbolic way, rather than a literal way. So symbols, it actually comes from the Greek sim and balein. Balein is to throw, and sim is together. So it brings two things together, right? So, you know, a podium, for example, in some ways is a symbol. It's a symbol of education and lecturing and so forth. A flag is a symbol. It's just a piece of cloth, but I wouldn't want to stomp on it in front of a bunch of people, you know? It's just cloth, but it's not just cloth. It's a symbol, right? And that's the power that myth has. It lifts us. You know, that the profane idea of a flag is that it's a piece of cloth. But the sacred idea is, oh, that flag actually is a symbol and it represents much more. So if you burn a flag or stomp on a flag, you're doing something more than just destroying a piece of cloth. And if I burn my shirt, nobody cares, right? It has no symbolic value. Right. So it's a different way of presenting truth that has a little bit more to do with subjective experience. So to say something is a myth, again, it doesn't mean it's not true. It means that there is a truth to it. It's a different way of communicating that. So I was looking at something, and they said an example of this would be the story of the boy who cried wolf. That's a myth, right? Now, historically, it probably never actually happened, right? I mean, everybody knows the story, right? The guy that is keeping watching the sheep, and he gets lonely, and so he calls, wolf, wolf, and all the town people come running. I can't assume people know these things anymore. Yeah. And there's no wolf, you know, and they go back home, he calls, wolf, wolf, again, they come running, and after this happens a few times, the townspeople get wise. They say, oh, there's no wolf. Well, of course, you know, the wolf then comes. The boy calls, nobody comes, the sheep get eaten, right? So, did that ever actually happen? We have no historical evidence for that, as far as I know, right? Does that mean that story's not true? Well, it's true in an important way, right? It's true in the sense that if you make claims that aren't verified over and over again, then people aren't going to trust you anymore. You know? So it's not about the literal truth, but it doesn't mean it's not true. It communicates truth in a different way through the vehicle of a symbol, a metaphor, or a story. Okay. Now, myths have many functions. Some myths probably do seem to have a historical, literal basis to them. So sometimes myths are ways that people have of preserving the stories of their communities. Myths have a sociological function. We'll be talking about this a little bit. Cheryl's kind of interested in this too, in that a community tends to define itself by its shared myths, by the stories of how, like in America, we have certain myths about our origins and what America means and how it developed. And those aren't all literally true. A great example of that is Parson Weems' story about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, and he says, "I cannot tell a lie with my little axe. I chop down the cherry tree." And it's a story about truthfulness and certain values that we like to see ourselves as having in America. And so that performs an important function because people that buy into that myth try to live by those values. There's a cosmological sense of myths. Some people, you'll read in Stark later, try to reduce myths to this. Miller, who did the early translations of the Upanishads and things like that, had this idea that a lot of myths are just pre-scientific stories. Like, we didn't understand why winter comes, like why it's cold outside. So we developed as human beings this story about how Persephone gets dragged down to the underworld for 6 months of every year, and Demeter goes into mourning, and everything dies, and we get cold and all this, right? And so sometimes we look at that and say, well, they didn't understand enough about science, so they made these stories, But myths do have this kind of cosmological function. They do help us kind of understand the world around us or tell us something about the world around us. And then finally, the fourth level is that they actually have a mystical meaning. And this is an area I'm particularly interested in, as Dr. Golden alluded to, is there is a certain experiential side to this. They often say something about our experience, okay? So, for example, just to not be too airy-fairy about this, one of the myths that you'll see over and over again is the story of the hero that overcomes trials, right? Just to really oversimplify. Well, if you read about heroes that overcome trials, even like the little engine that could or something, if anybody still reads that, I think I can. It tells you a story about when you confront obstacles in life, that may be your experiences of confronting and overcoming obstacles. So the mystical aspect to me is the experiential dimension of this.
Okay, so under these definitions, is there a difference between myth, folklore, and fables?
There is in a literary sense, right? But what I'm doing is I'm using myth mainly in a broad sense here. And the other distinction I would draw between myth and folklore and fables, now you can ask Dietrich or somebody about how an English major might define these things. But folklore and fables, to the most part, the way we think of them, they don't address ultimate questions of meaning, like what's the nature of the universe and the purpose of human beings here and things like that. Aesop's fable is kind of a cautionary tale or something like that, right? So I'm using the word myth loosely as a broader umbrella. But even though I just gave you the example of the boy who cried wolf, which probably helped prompt that question, that's not really where we're going to be going with this. We're going to be looking at the big narrative stories that the world religions tell. So, looking at mythos and logos as two ways of understanding the world, my take on analyzing religion, remember I said they give this list of things that religions do? One of the things that I look at is I say religions provide us with a framework of understanding and a framework or a guide to action. How do we understand the world? How do we behave in the world, right? So if we look at this from the perspective of mythos, the right brain, symbolic kind of aspect, then the way we understand the world is through myth. If you're Native American or Australian and you're walking through your geography, your landscape, you're walking by a mountain where a great battle just happened with the gods or something, right? So you're living these stories. The symbolic way that we act has to do with rituals that we perform, which rituals often involve reenacting these myths. So we'll see some examples of that.
Yeah.
From the logos perspective, we understand the world in a more left brain way, logical, analytical, and so that takes the form of doctrines rather than myths, right? So theology often tends up trying to take a myth or a story, and again, I'm not using that in a derogatory sense, take the story of a religion, and then explain what that means in kind of linear terms. And then in action, that typically takes the form of ethics. There's certain ways that we have rules for behavior, or we make decisions about what behavior is appropriate and what behavior is not appropriate. Right? So to me, these are 4 important elements of religion, whatever it is. The religions that we see are going to have myths and rituals and doctrines and ethics, very typically. So does that kind of make sense so far? Up to this point? All right. So in terms of understanding the world, myths are going to give us a worldview. They're going to give us a particular way of understanding ultimate reality, right? And again, you can kind of question whether, like, atheism or scientific materialism, to what degree you could think of that as religion, because it does make a statement about ultimate reality. It says this material world is all there is. Bam, right? Okay. So is that true, or is there more to life? And so it gives us some understanding of ultimate reality and some understanding of the world that we experience, some way to understand that. It gives us some understanding of human beings. Now, one of the things that most religions address is that something about being human seems to be a problem.
Yeah.
Interestingly, right?
Yeah.
I don't think my dog really worries about the meaning of life. I don't think my dog's really anxious about the afterlife or anything like that.
Yeah.
So, but human beings, we do worry about those things quite a bit sometimes, right? It can cause us a lot of anxiety.
Yeah.
So there's some way, and we can talk about why this is, that being human, we're a little bit out of joint, a little bit out of sync, a little bit disconnected maybe. Deligare, I guess. I don't know rather than So religions tend to have some sort of diagnosis of the human condition and say, well, what's really wrong? I mean, why aren't we happier than we are? And then typically they're going to propose a solution for that. Okay, well, the reason is this, and so therefore the answer is this. It's like you go to the doctor, you have the flu, here's the shot or whatever, right? Religions are also going to tell us something about human community, because there is no human being in isolation, really. As human beings, we're always in community, even if it's just on Facebook these days, right? And then, and part of our community is our history. So religions also give us a view of human history, and they give us a particular view of life and life after death. What happens after death? Again, scientific materialism. Candle goes out, flame's gone. But many religions will say that death is not necessarily death. So different ways of understanding these kind of things. And then I wanted to. I'm going to do that. Okay, I'm not going to worry about that right now for time's sake. I want to throw some terms out that will be important for us here when we're talking about doctrines about ultimate reality, not myths so much, but doctrines, right? And there are certain terms that we want to be familiar with here that we use to describe different ways of thinking about ultimate reality. So monotheism is the idea that there's one God. Now I might mention in this class, I'm going to make a couple of assumptions which are not always going to be correct. But one assumption is going to be that, like me, most of us have grown up in a country where, or in a culture where we are predominantly exposed to a Christian religious view. That's not always true, but for a lot of us it's going to be true. Even if you're not Christian, you've been exposed to it, right? You can't help that. A second assumption I'm going to make is that people in this class are going to span the continuum from true believers through agnostics to atheists, right? So, and that's fine. The only thing I ask is that people kind of be respectful of where other people are at in your comments in this class. So if you disagree respectfully, right? But there's room for all of this here. So if we think about ultimate reality, monotheism, actually these first two views are what we call theism. So the idea that there's one God or one ultimate reality, right? Now that ultimate reality can be personal or impersonal. Sometimes we'll call this theistic or deistic. It's not 100%, but so some religions are going to talk about an ultimate reality that is a personal God. Other religions are going to talk about an ultimate reality that is kind of an impersonal reality. And some religions, sorry, I'm slipping on languages here. are going to talk about how God is in everything, which we tend to call pantheism. And there are versions of that too. So everything is God. Now, a second view, and sometimes they go together, surprisingly, is polytheism, and that's the idea that there are many gods out there. And they can have, sometimes there's one God, high God, and then many gods under that. Sometimes there's just many gods. So polytheism is the idea that there are gods everywhere. And it's a little bit related to this idea of animism, which we'll talk about later. And animism is the idea that everything's alive, basically. Everything's inhabited by spirits. So I'll talk
Avatar,
about
the movie Avatar. No, the little
Yeah.
planet where everybody goes to Avatar. No. Sorry.
Yeah, it's an interesting view. So. And then let me go out of order here. I'll stick in order. Okay, so atheism is the idea there's no God, right? Okay. And then agnosticism literally means you just don't know. Agnostic means I haven't made up my mind. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. A means not, so agnostic means I don't know. So anyway, this terminology is helpful whenever you're getting into religions because we're gonna see kind of a range here. All right, and I've really kind of already talked about action, ritual, and ethics. So, for example, to look at the Christian religion again, which is not the only one we're going to look at, obviously here, right? But like, for example, in communicating truth, in a mythical expression, people might say Jesus is the Lamb of God. Okay, he's not a sheep. All right, so we know that's not meant to be taken literally, right? This is a mythical phrase that communicates something. And so that is expressed in ritual action in the Eucharist, which kind of comes from the Passover sacrifice of sacrificing a lamb. And so when Jesus dies on the cross, they talk about that as the sacrifice, right? Okay. And so when people partake in Holy Communion, they're reenacting that action, that myth in a sense, that story, right, through ritual. Then in the Logos sense, we're going to look at this in terms of dogma or doctrine and say, well, what does that mean to say Jesus is the Lamb of God? And then what many people in Christian religion say is, well, it has something to do with atonement, that people have sin, which they can't overcome on their own, and so Jesus does this act of sacrifice to atone for the sins and bring people back to God in a certain sense, whatever form that takes, right? And then in the form that takes in action has to do with ethics, right? That we also need to sacrifice ourselves. We need to put others ahead of ourselves, at least much of the time, or some of the time. So you can see in terms of looking at religion, we're going to be looking at myth, ritual, doctrine, and ethics. So does that kind of make sense with the example there to flesh that out a little bit? Okay. All right. Now, kind of running us up on time, so we may do our thing.
That's all right. Just go ahead. You're doing all right. We're okay.
So views of comparative religion. I'm actually going fast because usually this takes longer. So views of comparative religion. When we're looking at multiple religions together, that's what we mean by comparative religion. We don't necessarily mean we're evaluating, right? But we're going to look at different religions from different perspectives, and we'll give you overviews of that at some point. There are different ways of looking at these different religions. And again, I'm not going to be pushing any particular view, but I want to acknowledge that there are many views out there. So one view is that there is one true religion. Now, for many of us, it conveniently happens to be the one we're born in. Isn't that lucky? Yeah. One true religion, and it happens to be mine. That's a strange coincidence, okay? Now, you can maintain that my religion is the true religion, right? Within that, there are a couple of major ways that people look at other religions. One way is to say, I have the true religion, everybody else is just flat wrong, and you're a heretic, and you need to convert, or you're burned in fire, and I'll laugh at you, or something. I'll be a little silly. But another view is to say, and it's actually my understanding this is the official view of the Catholic Church, that my view is correct, and yet many other religions may have partial truth. And Stark really talks about this, right? That revelation comes to every society in one form or another. Right? Now, the others might be incomplete, right? Partial, maybe they're not quite as full of revelation or whatever, right? So I might still say, well, my religion is a true religion, but I can acknowledge that there is truth in other religions too. Now, another view that's out there is a view called the perennial philosophy, which really kind of says also there's one truth out there, but every religion kind of expresses that truth in a different way, right? Like the Christianity is going to express truth in one way, Islam's going to express that same truth in a different way, Buddhism is going to express that same truth in a different way. So it's sometimes people will say, you know, it's sort of like a mountain, and truth is at the top, and there's all these different roads that go to the top, but they're all headed the same way. So there's one truth out there, there's one ultimate reality, God or whatever it is, right? But there are many, many different ways that people understand that and express that. But we're all trying to get at the same thing. That's the viewpoint that's often called the perennial philosophy after Spinoza, I believe. I've never actually found it. Philosophia perennis. The postmodern view, which is the view that's very dominant among scholars today, is very anti-hierarchical. Postmodernism does not really believe in the idea of truth. It believes in the idea of interpretations. I'm oversimplifying again, Dr. Dietrich would probably have my eye for this. Right? But there are many different interpretations, but there's no truth out there. In other words, like, and it comes from literature, what does Hamlet mean? Well, there's no one meaning of Hamlet. Now, there are some meanings that are better than others, right? If I say it's a movie about a man's love for bacon, then I'm way off, right? So some interpretations are better than others, but there's no one meaning of Hamlet. So in the same way, there's no one truth that's out there, and every religion is going to be valid and equal. And so you can't really say one's better than another. That's a very much postmodern view. People talk about that as relativism often. Mm-hmm. And then finally, I kind of added this as an evolutionary understanding, which is the idea that throughout history, our understanding of religion evolves and changes over time. In other words, we go from less adequate understandings to more adequate understandings. And we don't really have time to discuss this, and you haven't necessarily done that reading yet. But this is kind of Stark's view as I take it. You know, he believes that there is a revelation that's out there, but it's an interesting idea. Religions actually compete in the marketplace. There's kind of a natural selection, and our understanding of religion evolves over time. Very, very interesting idea. So again, those of you in this class, I feel like puberty's hitting. You may be at different places with this in your understanding. You may think there's one true religion. You may think there's one truth, many reflections. Postmodern, they're all equal. You may think we're all kind of in this process of evolving and understanding over time. So it'll be interesting for you to kind of reflect on that as you go through the course. And at this point, I want to stop.
Okay. I'm glad your voice is still with us.
We've got about 10 minutes, but that's probably not a lot of time for you to talk about a historical view of religion.
I could introduce a little bit, mostly because I have a lot of notes, as Dr. Smith has, but I think some of them I can just maybe introduce a bit. But don't let me go too long without letting them know what we want them to do for Thursday. Right, so let's make sure I think we've already talked about it, just let's don't forget. Questions? One thing you'll notice if you read Matthew's, and you're going to read Matthew's because it's in your course calendar, is that he will also give you some definitions of a lot of the terms that Dr. Smith has just put up, right? So when you're thinking about your notes, and then maybe you go back and look at the PowerPoints, and then you look at Matthew's, you're going to see some connections, though they may not always agree, and that's okay. Yeah. So just take a look at, and you'll see some of this repeated in your readings. Any questions? Find the little very short PowerPoint put together. One of the things, and we'll do more next time, is we were talking earlier about how we want this class to go. And as a historian, and some of you are history majors, some of you have history classes, historians, especially when we're doing like a big world sim class, right? The history of the world part 1, I often joke, that's what we often do at college level. let's start with Paleolithic era, the Neolithic era, let's get people settled down. And then let's talk about Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and oh yeah, throw in China and India, and now it's midterm time, and oh, we are gonna get to Europe. And so it's a big tour of the world. And what are we trying to do in a world history class? What are you trying to do in a world history class?
Chronological order.
Chronological order. And what are you hoping to learn in a world history class?
Get the basic facts nailed down.
Basic facts and chronology nailed down about who lives along the Indus River versus who lives along the Yangtze, and what are maybe the major thinkers associated with the Yangtze River and the Indus River, and then, oh, that's Confucius, the folks who wrote the Bhagavad Gita. So, and then maybe it would be nice to get over to the Tigris Euphrates and then the Nile, and then, but that's just river civilizations. One of the things that historians do when they're looking to try to understand what these civilizations are about is they often come across a lot of religious texts. A lot of the texts that form the basis of this class, but also how Dr. Smith's putting together how do we decide mythos and logos, how do we decide ritual and dogma. These are the texts that we're using. And from a lot of the ancient societies, that's what we get in writing. In writing. Now, ancient historians also have to use the materials of ritual. They have to use artifacts, right? So you get words, which is lovely, but you also get things. And sometimes it's hard to know what kind of evidence this is. How would you use this evidence to discern the chronology of a given civilization? Who are the major thinkers in that given civilization? How do they live their daily lives? Economically, socially, politically, religiously. Sometimes you're left with are the religious texts. I often teach World Civ 1 and my students will say, hey, is this a comparative religion class? I'm like, well, no, but the evidence sort of takes us there. Why do you think that the predominant surviving literature from some of these civilizations is religious in nature?
That's important.
Say again?
It's most important.
Well, you could come to that conclusion, right? That it's important. You could also suggest other things. Why is it the religious texts survive when other kinds of texts do not?
Because the priests are the scholars.
Because
And they have better archives.
religious class, perhaps, is the literate class. You find lots of times in Christian literature, in polytheistic Roman literature, in Hindu literature, that there's something important about writing. There's something sacred about writing. The Greeks call writing in Egypt, what do we call the original writing in Egypt? Hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs. In Greek?
Sacred writings.
Sacred writing. I'm looking at these people because they're taking a Greek. Sacred writing. That's what the Greeks call it. They don't know for sure that the Egyptians think the hieroglyphs are sacred writing, but that's what they call it because, wow, it's so fancy. And look at all the stuff they write. It has a lot to do with gods. It must be sacred. So there is this kind of understanding that the written word, the logos, is important, right? And it's somehow sacred. And so in a lot of ancient societies, when you're trying to find the history of a society, you really have to go to the sacred text. That's what you got. And also that's what's left. That's what's left. That's what we can find, yeah? So what's a historian to do with all this stuff? If you're not particularly a theologian and you don't particularly want to look at religion, what are, of the world, I needed to put a world map up. Historians like maps, we have to have a map. We have to know physically where we are. Dr. Smith is like, he's all metaphysical and all, ultimate reality. I'm in Wichita, Kansas. I don't know where you are. I'm in Wichita, Kansas, and I need to find that on a map because I'm an historian, and we need to know where we're starting. So we like that. The rest of it might be, ultimate reality, I don't know, but we need to start somewhere. So we need a physical place to start. We need a chronology where we can find it. So we're going to go to all these crazy places. This is a map that discusses the spread of Homo sapiens sapiens, and it's a theory about lots of good evidence about where humans, the oldest fossils in the human record, right, seem to come from Africa right now. And then, as you follow the arrows, the more recent finds around 70,000 years ago, we're finding in Western Asia, interestingly. the homeland of a lot of the religious groups we're gonna be looking at, right? And then, and so forth and so on. So we like maps. So we want, when we find historical text to go along with historical artifacts, we're excited. And oftentimes they're religious, but what can you do with it? How far can you take that? Oh, we're gonna run out of time quickly. Yeah, that's a little fast. Give me the other 5. We're gonna run out of time quickly, but have you seen this image before? I show this a lot in civ classes. You might see it in an art class. What does it mean?
Pretty cattle or buffalo. So warthog.
Some cattle, buffalo, warthog,
Horses.
boar.
Horses.
I see horses. At least over to the top right. Okay, you gave me pictorial assessment, right? I asked you, what does it mean?
Prosperity.
Prosperity. Why?
Because usually the more like farm animals are more prosperous.
Interesting. We got a lot of animals that we can potentially eat or use in some other fashion. Yes.
Leisure time.
Say again, leisure time. Got time to sit around in a very dark place, by the way.
I would say freedom,
Freedom, how so?
because they all run in the same direction, so they may be running for something from something.
You think they are running in the same direction or not running in the same
They are
They
running or moving in the same.
Maybe running from someplace. They do all seem to be headed in the same direction. This one kind of fat fellow on the bottom seems to be going that way. But very interesting. So freedom, prosperity, leisure time. Is it educational? How about for the people who are looking at it? Or the person who made it?
No.
No.
I think it's meant more for memory.
For memory. We're going to categorize animals and we're going to put them on a wall. Is it religious?
Depending what religion, if you view a certain animal as religious.
No, these are all things. These are all the kinds of things that historians ask of the evidence that they look. Right? This is from France. You see ease and all that. This is about 4 inches high, by the way. People are always surprised to know it's little. Venus? Willendorf is the village in which it was founded.
A little anachronistic.
Yeah. Clearly female. Very prominent breasts and genitalia. No face. No good Greek would sculpt a Venus without a great face. Or Roman for that matter. But yeah. What is this for? What's the purpose of this 4-inch little clay thing?
Fertility.
Fertility. That's what we tell you. Every class you'll ever see it in. Fertility goddess. There you go. Fertility goddess, 4 inches tall. Greeks would not make their fertility goddesses 4 inches tall. But that's the Greeks. I bring this to you because some of the interesting problems with archaeology, and we really need to stop, is that when we find stuff from the ancient world, if we can't figure out what it's for, right? If we can't figure out, oh, that's a tool for digging, that's and planting crops, that's a tool for managing animals, that's a lovely decorative picture to put on your table to serve your tea, that's a coin, that is something to do with economic exchange. If we can't figure out what something is, the go-to in archaeology is religious and ritual. Because if we don't know what it's for, the go-to is, oh, that must have some religious purpose that we don't understand. Is that fair? I had a friend who sent me a postcard from Ankara, Turkey, and the image of it was a little jug that looked like a goat, and you could pour milk out of it. And it said, ceremonial goat.
No.
I thought, no, that's something you could pick up at a farmer's market that's like, oh, that's kind of a kitschy little milk dispenser.
Like
Oh, no.
Ms. Butterworth is a
Yeah.
Venus figurine, right?
Yeah, so again, we'll talk more, and I know we're out of time, but the idea is, what can they do with religious history, with religious ritual, with religious symbolism, right? How can you understand that if you're trying to get at the human condition, if you're trying to figure out what life was like in Mesopotamia before it became Iraq, what life was like in Europe before it became the EU. How can you use religion to understand that, or can you? So we'll get to more of that. For Thursday, we're hoping that you'll have read some of the materials we're looking at. We're hoping you'll get to Blackboard and introduce yourself at Blackboard, that first discussion group, and also start to look at the questions there and contribute. And we'll be looking, and we're hoping on Thursday to bring in some of your insights and discussions into our understanding of this course. And we'll talk a little bit more about the historian's role in this and get into some ideas of our earliest materials. Okay, questions? Well, thanks for coming along on this ride. And thanks for putting up with our moving of classrooms. We'll be in the other one next time, so come back over there. And if you
Because
know
they messed
Tamar-
with it. So.
Yeah, if you know Tamar and is it Stephanie McAvoy? Miss McAvoy. Samantha McAvoy, tell them, come on to class, we're not scared. Or maybe we are scared, maybe they're right. Okay, see you later. Have a good day. See you Thursday. Watch out for snow.
Do you have any office hours today?
Say again.
Do you have any office hours today?
I do not. Are you available right now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, cool. We can do it now.
How are you?
Oh, not bad. We're meeting at 12:05 on Thursday, right?
We are meeting at 12:05 on Thursday.
For Greek,
Um,
I hope.
yes. Hang on a second. Let me make sure I've got this. Crap.
I'm actually going to go to the bathroom, but I will be over to your
Okay.
Thank you.